Welcome everyone to this first session of the first BTO virtual conference. We're sorry that this year the pandemic means that we can't meet you in person, but it's exciting to see that it's just ticking over to 400 people connected to this session, and doubtless more on the YouTube and Facebook live streams, far more than we could have hoped to cram into the conference centre at Swanwick. So I guess there's some upside. You're all very welcome indeed. I'm Ben Darville. I'm BTO's Development and Engagement Manager working out of our Scottish office in Stirling. I'm going to be your host for this evening. We've got 3 fantastic talks lined up, which I hope you'll enjoy. And after each, there'll be a short time for questions. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. Just type them in there. And if you see any particularly good ones in there, you can give them a sort of like or a thumbs up and give them greater prominence. And we'll try and pick out some of those at the end of each talk. If you've got any questions of a more general nature, if you can save those, please, for the AGM on Saturday. We've got 14, I should say, free talks and a couple of panel discussions this week. And all of this is only really possible thanks to the amazing support of BTO members. So thanks to all of you that are here today. It's income from membership and donations that makes up almost half of our charity's income. And without that support, we wouldn't be, the organisation wouldn't be what it is today. This is a tough time for so many reasons, for so many people. And for charities like ours, the future is quite uncertain. Our income's really suffering due to COVID. We know that you support us in so many different ways. We're grateful for all of that support, and we always feel a bit sort of awkward asking for this sort of thing. But if you are in a position to make a donation to support our work, we'd be extraordinarily grateful. And you can do that via a special conference link that you're seeing there on screen, bto.org/support. Also, if you enjoy today's talks and you feel like BTO is an organisation that you'd like to support, please do consider joining us if you aren't a member already. It's through membership support that we're able to do our important work, inspiring and educating people and advancing our collective understanding of birds through research. So if you can, please do support us in one of those ways. But without any further waffle from me, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, John Calladine, who's going to speak to you about his amazing research into the movements of short-eared owls. Over to you, John.
Okay, thank you. So it now tells me that the host has disabled the participant screen sharing.
Try now, John.
Okay, are we getting there?
Getting there. If you just start that slideshow, I think we're off.
There we go. Okay,
that's grand.
Okay, thank you very much. Short-eared owls. First of all, a little bit of background as to why we're tracking short-eared owls. Firstly is the population has declined. We've lost about half of their breeding range over the past 40 years. And they're quite a rare bird. We can sort of see the population range here, ranging between about 600 to just over 2,000 pairs. That's a broad range. That sort of reflects our paucity of knowledge about the birds, but also that the numbers of these birds actually does vary quite markedly. The principal food of these birds is voles, and vole numbers fluctuate across space and time. And short-eared owls have an uncanny ability to actually find where there are local and often temporary hotspots of voles. So in some years, there can be quite good numbers of birds, and in other years, there can be next to none or even none over the same site. So they're very difficult and challenging to monitor. The kinds of places that these birds live in are open moorland, semi-natural grasslands. And we can sort of see from the habitats, from the range here on the left, which is from the latest atlas, this is the breeding distribution around about 2010. We can actually see a few things that are probably limiting these birds and cause as to why they might have declined. First of all, we look at the distribution, and it's concentrated on islands, and in this case, it's islands that have voles. Notice island groups to Shetland that don't have populations of voles. There are no breeding short-eared owls there. Similarly, in Ireland, that has no native populations of voles. The birds there are pretty few and far between compared to in Britain. So as well as islands, also moorland in areas that are managed for grouse moors. Now, this is kind of a distribution that we see for a lot of ground nesting birds. Short-eared owls nest on the ground. So species such as waders and other ground nesting birds often show this distribution. Ground nesting birds are prone to predation by ground predators. So their distribution is concentrated in areas where ground predators are scarce, either naturally, as in these insular populations, or through management. One of the key factors of grouse moor management is that they control predators. So this is a distribution that we see for short-eared owls as well as other ground nesting birds. But going back to one of the reasons why we wanted to track short-eared owls, it's been acknowledged quite recently that perhaps one of the greatest threats to short-eared owl populations is our lack of knowledge of even their basic ecology. So 4 years ago, in 2017, we started tracking these birds using satellite GPS tags. Here you can see a solar panel, tags attached to these birds using a harness, aiming to actually find out more about these birds. Amongst our principal objectives was to find out about the habitat use during the breeding season. If we could find out about habitat use at other times of year, that would have been a bonus. And the absolute icing on the cake would be to understand more about the wider scale movements. For example, how do these birds actually find these hotspots of voles, which are often temporary? They've just got this uncanny ability where the vole numbers are there, these birds just suddenly appear, often in numbers, to understand why they could do that. And the implications for the ongoing management of land to maintain suitability for short-eared owls and hopefully stem or even reverse their current decline. Now, this is an example of some of the data that we're getting from these satellite tags. Each of the fixes we get from the birds, it's once every 3 hours, and the fixes are accurate to 2 to 3 meters. So they're really accurate. So you can pinpoint the kinds of habitats they're using over a landscape. Now, this area is in Perthshire, and there are 3 home ranges here, two breeding ranges here and here, and also one which was occupied in late summer and autumn. A typical home range during the summer is about 200 to 250 hectares. And because of the accuracy of these locations we're getting from these tags, we can identify what habitats they're using within this moorland mosaic of habitat. And here we've simplified it down to show what are on heather by the red dots and what were in the grasslands as shown by the yellow dots. This is what that area looks like from the ground. You can see the heather, which is managed for grouse shooting. You can see the burnt areas of heather on here, and also patches of grass within that heather, and also the grasses around the perimeter. If we actually look at the numbers that have come from this tracking information, we actually look at the availability of the grasses and the heather within this moorland habitat. They're roughly equally available within this general landscape. However, by looking at what the owls are selecting for, they are selecting by far preferentially the grassland areas as opposed to the heather areas. So these owls prefer the grasses to the heather, which has a lot of implications for management of moorland for owls and also for other birds. The reasons they go for the grasses are where the voles are, so they're spending their time doing that. However, most moorland areas can be managed specifically for heather, and they target heather expansion and heather management often at the expense of those grasses. So that's at the expense of the areas that have the voles and at the expense of the areas that the short-eared owls are using. The reasons why the heather is targeted for positive management is mostly because of red grouse. Red grouse, like heather, the more heather you've got more red grouse, and you can make more money by shooting more red grouse on those areas. However, probably arguably a little bit more concerning is that there are a number of conservation initiatives that aim to increase heather. You can get agro-environment schemes that increase heather cover at the expense of grass. And also conservationists often look at moorland and assess its condition in terms of habitat condition, suitability. A score of so-called conservation suitability is based on heather cover and heather quality. And if I sort of think about the assemblage of birds that use these moorland habitats, I can really only think of red grouse as the only species that really benefit from heather. We're now getting this data from short-eared owls that shows the importance of grasses. And I think of most of the other birds that include in these areas. For example, there are a lot of curlews, lapwing, a few redshank, windchat, a whole range of other birds. And I suspect if we knew those in as much detail as we've now found out about the short-eared owls, those two would be at least as equally favouring the grassland as they are the heather. So to argue for conservation management in the future, we should be thinking about grassland, suitable grassland structure to support voles and whatever these other species are targeting the grasses for, at least equally as important to the heather. The whole concept of managing grasslands for voles is not new. Here in the Netherlands, we've got examples of arable farmland in which we've got these strips which have been created specifically to encourage voles. In that instance, it was for breeding Montague Terriers, but by creating these, they're also found that they're being used by hen harriers, marsh harriers, and short-eared owls. Also, in the winter, they're using these, but a few birds, few short-eared owls are also starting to breed in some of these lowland farmland landscapes. So you can imagine if we could actually equally have incentives to manage grasslands for voles, not only the uplands, we could actually have them in more of the agricultural lowlands. And we could actually have probably hot spots for predatory birds, vole-eating birds in the lowlands, as well as on the moorlands. Using this sort of tracking data, we can actually understand how these birds are using the landscapes at different times of the season and at different times of day. Now, there's a short-eared owl nest in the rushes in the foreground of this picture. And if you read any good textbook, they'll tell you that short-eared owls fly around in the daytime, as indeed they do, but the area that they fly during daylight hours is really quite limited. By far, most of their activity is night. Despite what you read in some of these books, short-eared owls are predominantly nocturnal birds. Not only are they more active at night, they range much more widely at night time. Not only do they range much more widely, they go up onto the higher ridges, as you can see up here. Now, why do these short-eared owls go up on the high ground at night? Could it be that the voles are more active up there and easier to hunt for? Possibly, but I can find no evidence to suggest that should be the case. However, those high ridges during the daytime are where diurnal predators such as golden eagles hunt. Golden eagles are quite important predators of short-eared owls. Go to many golden eagle nests in areas where there are short-eared owls. It's quite common to find the remains of short-eared owls within those nests or nearby. They see them as competitors, and the way they deal with competitors is to simply take them out. So the short-eared owls avoid going up there during the daytime, but they're quite happy to go up there and exploit those areas at night. Interestingly, when the short-eared owls are on this higher ground at night time, we're getting increasing evidence that these lower lying areas are actually being hunted over by the closely related long-eared owls that nest in some of the nearby woodlands. And we're starting to see that this could be a way of how these two closely related species that are exploiting the same food resources, the voles, can actually divide up the resources in this habitat. Short-eared owls are happy down here during the daylight hours, but they go up onto the high ground at night time, and while the short-eared owls are up on the high ground, then the long-eared owls come in during the darkest hours of night to hunt over those areas. They're dividing this resource up by different times of day that they're using it. As we said, this whole area, there's also lots of barn owls in these areas too. I don't know how they actually sort of fit into dividing up this landscape, but it'd be something I would really love to do in future, is to actually get the sort of detailed habitat use by all the predators that use these landscapes. And I think if we've got that information, we'd have a better understanding of how these birds divide up the resources in this area. And it would give us a greater understanding about how a multitude of predatory birds can actually use these different landscapes all at the same time, and would actually inform how we could manage them for a whole diversity of these birds, not just a single species like that. As these birds wander around the uplands, we're starting to learn how they interact and are affected by different ways that these upland areas are developed. For example, wind farms. Mostly they're avoiding wind farms. These few locations that we're getting within the footprint of the wind farm that you can sort of see here, is actually when the turbines are not operating, when there's no wind. So when the turbines are not operating, they're not making any noise. And it seems like the owls are quite happy to go into that area. However, as a sort of general principle, it seems to be they're avoiding these areas. So you build a wind farm, which are often on those higher ridges, which these birds use during the night time, then build a wind farm there. It is largely excluded for use by short-eared owls in the future. And the other main land use that's happened quite extensively is afforestation. And indeed, it is sort of planting of trees over the upland areas that's probably responsible for quite a lot of the loss of range over that 40-year period that I said. But here we're starting to see how these birds can actually use some of the plantations. Again, mostly avoiding the slightly older plantations, but they are coming into the younger plots, but specifically going into the unplanted areas. And in some other areas, we're actually seeing that they actually make greater use of the bigger unplanted areas or the bigger areas of young plantation or young growth areas in the second rotations that use that. And interestingly, it's appearing that sort of where those patches of open ground or very young growth are approaching 200 hectares or more, then the short-eared owls are very happy to use those areas, which sort of could inform us how we could actually manage new forests in a rotation to actually include some of these unplanted areas, or make sure that throughout their lifetime there are areas of extensive young growth in those areas that could be big enough to be occupied by short-eared owls, so these forests could be used throughout their lifetime, rather than they were actually completely relying on grouse moors. We could actually sort of start to think of actually managing forest in the long term for these birds. Now, how do these birds actually use the whole sort of landscapes as they move around, not just within the sort of the breeding areas? So I'm going to talk about this one particular bird that we tagged in May 2017. This background map is central Scotland, and we tagged her while she was on her nest. We tagged her at her nest on the hills of the Oak Hill Hills, just above Stirling, quite literally about 4 miles from where I'm sitting right now. For those of you know, this is the Firth of Forth that you can see coming in, Stirling there. So this is a map of central Scotland. She stayed with her young when they were young, but almost as soon as the young grew and were able to thermoregulate for themselves and didn't need brooding anymore, she left them and she moved to an area in Perthshire, about 40 kilometres away. Every female that we have tagged so far has left their young at about that stage. They leave the male alone to finish off the chick rearing process by themselves. The females do all the incubation. They do all the brooding. I think they do all the brooding. I don't think the males spend much time, if any time, doing that. And I suspect that takes up all their resources and they have to sort of move on after that period, leaving the males to do the young, to look after the young to fledging, which this, the mate of this bird successfully did in that case. This bird moved on to about 40 kilometres away in Perthshire and occupied a range, sort of a few patches of sequential home ranges, but then made the odd exploratory visit some distances away down towards Glasgow and out towards Glenlyon in the Highlands. Excuse me, which is really interesting because this area in Perthshire, there's a lot of voles at that time, but still she made exploratory visits. And we're starting to see how these birds might actually explore the habitats to find out what conditions are like. She had a good patch, a home patch with lots of food there, but still made occasional trips elsewhere just to see if there were conditions that were better. And it's quite a secure sort of way to do that, because if you know you've got somewhere that is good enough to go back to, it obviously makes it worthwhile seeing what else could happen. You know, if there's anywhere else that is better that they could move to. The tags are solar powered, and at the end of October, we lost track of that bird at that time. Just simply not enough daylight in these latitudes to carry on transmitting from these tags. However, come the following February 2018, the tag refired and she was still in the same area in Perthshire. However, at the end of March, she made a round trip, basically a 500 kilometre round trip to the north coast, came back through the West Highlands, returned to Perthshire, went back to that same patch in Perthshire, and as soon as she got back, she settled to breed. Again, why? Clearly, she made this journey just before when she was actually in condition to breed. She was settling to breed. Why did she make this journey elsewhere? Maybe it was just to see if there was anywhere better that she could breed. Maybe it's to see if she could find a better mate, while she actually had somewhere she knew was good enough to go back to. Just checking, was there somewhere better to go to? She laid her eggs, chicks hatched, got to the stage that they could thermoregulate themselves. And as before, she left, and she left to the northeast. Again, her mate successfully fledged the rest of those chicks over that period. She carried on across the North Sea, took 16 hours to do that, and then carried on into Norway, did a bit of a U-turn, and then, much to our astonishment, she settled to breed again in Norway. So that she bred 2 times in the same season, 1,000 kilometers apart in 2 countries. This is the kind of place she, or this is actually where she bred in Norway. You can see it is sort of the Arctic alpine shrubland, willows, birch there. It's kind of interesting to see the habitat that is used there. If you actually look at the availability, grassland is actually more available over the whole area that these owls were using than the dwarf shrubs. But in contrast to what they do in the heather, they were using the dwarf shrubs much more preferentially than they were the grasslands. Presumably this diverse structure and actually diversity of species of dwarf shrub rather than just single species of heather actually accommodate the voles that within this area and actually facilitate the hunting of the voles in this area, which makes you wonder if we could recreate habitats like these on our own mountain tops, as would be the case naturally, would those areas become available for short-eared owls to breed in? I think that's an interesting thought. We lost track of that bird in Norway in September, but much to our astonishment, she reappeared in Ireland in October and continued to travel around Ireland. However, towards the end of November, even in the sunny south of Ireland, the tag stopped transmitting. However, come February, she reappeared on Dartmoor. Interestingly, on Dartmoor, her switching behaviour changed. She was actually spending the daytime roosting on the moor at high elevations, and at night time travelled to the lowland farmlands to feed, which kind of shows that these birds can adapt their behaviour depending on where they find them. They can take into account where the food is available, what are the competitive and predation risks, and they've got this plasticity of behaviour that they can do that. At an individual bird can change its behaviour to accommodate the conditions that it finds itself in as it wanders around, well, the world, basically. We thought she was going to settle on Dartmoor, but no, she went on and moved to the fens just outside of Peterborough, where again, we thought she was going to settle, but no, she carried on to the North Norfolk coast, then clearly tried to get back to Norway. Fortunately, she got to within a few tens of kilometres of the Norwegian coast, but hit some really bad weather. There were some northeasterly gales at the time, lots of snow, and she veered west, and that was the last we heard from her. And presumably she died at sea after 28 hours flying against the wind in those conditions. So that journey wasn't very successful. We're actually finding that these birds don't actually live that long. So we know this bird had bred in 2 years and actually had 3 breeding attempts in those years. That is actually quite good. These birds have the ability to move around, find good areas to breed, and when they do breed, they can actually lay large clutches and rear large broods. So they don't need many breeding attempts to replace themselves. Basically, they've got a strategy, a lifetime strategy of breeding hard but dying young. It's kind of interesting, though, that while she was here in Peterborough, why she should make this long crossing across the North Sea rather than trying to attempt to get back to Scotland, where we know she had bred successfully in the 2 previous years. As it happens, in this year, 2019, there were virtually no voles in mainland Scotland, and basically virtually no short-eared owls. So did she actually know it was not worth going back to Scotland at that time? And I suspect actually she could have actually done that, because these owls do communicate with each other in a way. They roost communally. And I suspect that they could actually make a judgment call on actually looking at the flight directions of birds, what the body conditions of those birds are in, and decide whether it's actually worth flying in any directions. So basically, you know, if this bird actually saw any birds coming in from the north, from where she was down in Peterborough, if they were particularly lean birds, not in good condition, she could make that judgment call as to actually it's not worth traveling in that direction. So I suspect there's actually a degree of communality here. And if we actually think about each of these individual birds making these exploratory movements when they've got base from their home ranges, coupled by a rather more extensive way of communality and communicating, being able to sort of interpret from the behavior of other birds as to where are the good conditions, or at least which directions are profitable to fly in, or equally importantly, which areas are not profitable to fly in, then you can sort of see how these birds can quite efficiently and easily find these hotspots of voles and food availability as they occur. You can start to understand how these birds have this really fantastic ability to just home in on food supplies as where and whenever they become apparent. Now we've tracked so far 21 of these tag birds, which was actually our target we wanted to do. And this is all the tracks that we've got to date. A number of things to sort of see from this. So actually look at these, we've got a small cluster of birds that we tagged this year in Iceland. It was part of our plan that we wanted to tag birds in different areas with different prey bases and also sort of different predator and competitor bases. We were hoping to do this on a few different islands around Scotland this year. Clearly that wasn't feasible because of COVID. However, we were able to collaborate with people in Iceland for those people there to actually tag 3 birds this year. We're actually finding they're using, there are no voles in Iceland, which is also one of the really interesting things. But there, one of the principal prey items are actually wood mice, and the wood mice there are actually larger than our wood mice. They were introduced perhaps with the original human colonists 1,000 years ago, and in that time they've actually become quite big wood mice. So they're clearly sort of quite suitable prey for short-eared owls in the absence of voles. And also from where these birds are feeding and the pellets that have been collected from those birds, young waders and in the winter, even adult purple sandpipers appear to be important prey in those areas. These sort of highlighted points that you can see here are actually the currently active tags, or ones that we expect to be active, bearing in mind that quite a few tags it is now the middle of winter, and most of these tags have switched off now, hoping they'll reappear come the spring. Well, another thing to sort of notice from these birds, most of these birds have been tagged in central Scotland or on the Isle of Arran, is actually the individuality between the birds. Each bird seems to do something very different. Some have gone to Norway for the summer. Some have actually travelled down to North Africa. And this incredible one actually travelled as far east as Russia before travelling down and unfortunately dying just a few weeks ago in Mauritania. So some of these birds are actually doing these long journeys. It's kind of interesting why some of these birds should make these long journeys. 2 of them so far we know have died. And this one down in Libya, we actually haven't heard from a few weeks. It might be bad news for her. Just curious why they should actually make those long journeys while other birds are actually remaining further north. Some of them are actually still on the breeding grounds. Why do they make that decision to do that? And it's also interesting that sort of a few years ago, we did analysis of ringing recoveries of short-eared owls. And we speculated there was actually a change in the distances that the birds moved. And it appeared like there was an association with population densities. When population densities were high, these birds tended to migrate further. When populations were low, they tended to stay closer to where they were breeding. In this case, we're sort of thinking, as I said at the start, these populations have declined, but clearly, even from a rather modest sample of just 21 birds, we're starting to see quite a number of movements over very long distances for these birds. So is there something that has the population actually taken a turn and increasing? So first, to answer the question as to why some birds might stay at home and why others sort of move the distances. These are actually winter home ranges. Here's the Isle of Arran, and this is Kintyre on the left-hand side. We're actually finding the winter home ranges are between 3 and 5 times larger what they use in the summer. Remember that each of these home ranges, as far as we know, is occupied by a single bird. A breeding home range is occupied by a pair and then its young. So come autumn, come winter, there's more birds. There's got young to occupy. Each of the pair needs a bigger home range. So there's actually competition for space in winter. So some of the birds have to move on. When there's high densities, they have to move greater distances, which might explain why some of those birds are actually traveling those greater distances. Just take a look at this sort of one bird that in its winter range. It was actually roosting often at night on the Isle of Arran, then traveling over, so roosting during the day on the Isle of Arran and traveling over at night time to feed over on mainland Kintyre, making the journey back in the earliest hours of the morning. Over that period that that bird was there, he'd make that sea crossing a total of 47 times. Really quite astonishing. And coming to sort of why they make these long journeys, does it reflect that the populations have increased? Well, actually, if we look at the latest European Bird Atlas data, actually, these green dots here represent areas where the populations have actually colonized, have actually increased in the past since the 1990s. So it does look like at a European scale, there has been a recent increase in short-eared owls. So maybe the population, the fortunes of the birds are changing, and this has led to some of those increases in migratory distances that were recorded. Why they've increased in some of these areas, absolutely, I'm not so sure, but it may be to do with land abandonment in parts of Eastern Europe, maybe changes in agricultural subsidies from headage payments through to area payments. So maybe areas are not being grazed so tightly, and there are sort of more voles in some of these areas. It remains to be seen. But I'm sort of delighted to say that sort of following our success with tracking these birds, quite a few of our colleagues in Europe have started studying these birds and actually looking at the behavior of these birds and using similar tags. We're now getting tagged birds in Spain, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, and in the Czech Republic. So as well as we're finding the birds out that we found from our birds that have been tagged in Scotland, over the coming years, we're going to find out a lot more from these birds across Europe. And there are also initiatives now in North America where people are starting to tag these birds. So basically, this is sort of a summary. I won't go through it in detail. You can either read this or look at it on the recording and pause it and actually read it in detail to show you. But it shows that what we have actually learned a lot from these birds tagged in Scotland, and hopefully we're going to learn a lot more from the birds tagged in Europe. Next phase for us is to wait for the tagged birds to do what they're going to do, get their data. We've started processing that data, analyze it, put it into the public domain, report on it so that people can use that information for the benefit of short-eared owls and also for the habitat in which they live. And I'm actually thinking for this as a bird that once we actually know what these birds actually need to live throughout the year, they're a bird that will actually find those conditions wherever we create them. They've got this dispersal capability to do that. They're a bird, you create the habitat, you create conditions for these birds, they will find it and they will use it. Probably not every year, but they'll use it when the voles or the prey items are there. It's a bird that we can actually work with very effectively. So finally, just a thank you to the many people who've actually helped over the years, sort of building up this work, and the people who've helped us catch the birds, tag the birds, whole range of people. A special thanks to these three people who've done masses of work to work on these things. And also thanks to the people who have funded this work through individual donations. And this is a not so subliminal message to say where you can actually donate in the future to continue our studies on owls altogether. And thank you very much for listening to me.
Thanks so much, John, for a fantastic talk, and judging by the flurry of questions that have been coming in, it's generated a lot of interest. I'm going to start, if you don't mind, with one that I think's right up your street, given your other research interests. And this is from Kay Sutton. I'm wondering about whether the National Mass Tree Planting Initiative in response to the climate crisis is likely to impact grasslands and hence short-eared owls. What are your thoughts on that? She also mentions other grassland specialists, and I guess you can include breeding waders in that perhaps as well. John seems to have temporarily frozen. Not sure why that is. Given that, I'm not quite sure what's happened there, but given that, I think we might move on to Chris, and we'll perhaps come back to John if we're able to resolve that technical issue. So Chris, if I can invite you to start sharing your screen, we'll try and come back to questions from John later.
Sure.
So Chris is going to talk to us about his amazing work on cuckoo tracking, which I think many of you will have seen and heard about before, but this is going to be the very latest from Chris. Over to you, Chris.
Can you hear me okay, Ben?
We can hear. If you can just start your screen share, then we should be off and running.
Okay, I think I'm sharing my screen now. Can you see that?
No, that's not shared just yet.
Okay, let me see if I can, hang on, I think,
Yep, that's coming now. Great. If you just start that presentation, then you're off. Yep, that's everything. Okay. That's great. Over to you, Chris.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Ben. Hello, everybody. So as you can see, the title of my talk is Cuckoos, Conservation and the Costs of Migration. I'm going to start by giving you a recap on the UK cuckoo tracking work that we've been doing since 2011. In particular, I'm going to focus on what we've learnt about the causes of decline of the cuckoo in this country, and also about talking about the costs of migration, what we've learnt about them. Before I go on in the remainder of the talk, the majority of it to talk about the tracking that we've done of Far Eastern populations of the cuckoo. So it was the advent of new technology, specifically this 5-gram satellite tag from microwave telemetry, which enabled us to start our tracking work on cuckoos. And it's effectively enabled us to revolutionise our understanding of cuckoo migration. This map here shows the population changes of cuckoos according to BBS. And you can see in the south and east, we've got red areas here showing big declines. And in the north and west, we've got blue areas, which represent those areas where the population has increased. And against this background, in 2011, we tagged our first 5 birds in East Anglia, right in the heart of the area where the biggest declines were occurring. Across the first 4 years of the project, we tagged birds in a range of locations stratified partly by population change, but also by latitude and major habitat type. And you'll notice that these are hotspots of cuckoos, buffered to some extent from the environmental changes that have gone on in the surrounding areas. And this means that we're able to potentially pick up a signal of migration more easily than we would have done by choosing random locations. This map shows the southward migrations of the cuckoos across the first 4 years of the project. And you can see we've got one route in red, showing birds leaving the country and Europe in a southeasterly direction and stopping over mostly in northern Italy before moving south over the Sahara. And another route in yellow, showing birds that leave in a southwesterly direction, stopping over in Spain before moving south into West Africa. And these birds then move east and converge on the routes of the other birds, and both groups end up wintering in exactly the same place in the Congo Basin in Central Africa. And this in itself is a unique and unusual pattern in that normally if birds take different routes from their starting place, they'd end up in different places, a pattern known as migratory connectivity. But the fact that these birds started and ended at the same place gave us an opportunity to look at the cost of migration as they refer to specific routes. So we had 23 journeys by 20 birds taking the southwestern route, 33 journeys by 22 birds taking the southeastern route. And we found that there was actually a significant difference in survival of the two groups. So only just over half of the birds that migrated via Spain survived to reach south of the Sahara, whereas nearly all of the birds which migrated via Italy did so. So because we know that this Spanish route is slightly shorter, this shows not only were there route-specific costs of migration, in this case measured by mortality, but also that they weren't proportional to distance, as is often supposed in migration studies. Not only did the birds survive differently, but they were also these two different routes distributed differently across the UK. And we found that there was actually a close correlation between the prevalence of this less successful route via Spain and the population decline across breeding populations. And this gives us some confidence that the mortality, because of this migration route, is contributing anyway to the population declines that we see in the UK. Now, obviously, that sort of information is really important for conservation, but if we zoom out and add in other populations that we've been tracking from elsewhere in Europe, in particular Bavaria here and Belarus here, we can see some commonalities start to arise. In particular, the clockwise loop migration that most birds, apart from the UK southwest birds, use. And in spring, this takes them to West Africa, and nearly all of the populations that have been studied so far in Europe stop over in this area here, Ivory Coast and Ghana in spring, where they fuel up for their northward crossing of the Sahara. So this is a potential conservation hotspot, and this shows us the sort of information that we need to identify those areas that most need to be conserved to preserve species. If we zoom out again and add in further populations, including some which migrate from the far eastern part of the breeding range that we've tracked ourselves from Beijing, and our colleagues have tracked from Copenhagen, we can see that birds from right across the breeding range, the entire longitudinal width of the breeding range, have converged on a relatively small area of Central and Southern Africa. The same applies also to some cuckoos that we tagged last year in Mongolia as part of the Mongolia Cuckoo Project, which has similar aims to the UK and Beijing tracking projects that we've already done. Firstly, most importantly perhaps, is scientific discovery, learning obviously about the annual cycle of the cuckoos, but also, where relevant, the causes of population decline. Equally importantly, public engagement, including via the websites. Many people have been able to follow the cuckoo migrations from the UK on a daily basis on the BTO's website. And also, more broadly, education, the idea to inspire young people and others to care more about the migratory birds and the natural world in general. So the very first bird that we tagged in the Far East in the Beijing project was Flappy McFlapperton, named by Beijing school children in an urban wetland park in Beijing itself. And from the size of her, we thought that she was probably a nominate race rather than the local race female. And so it proved. From Beijing, where she was tagged, over the next week or so, she migrated northwards another 1,100 kilometers to a breeding location on the northern edge of Mongolia. So she became quite a celebrity, Flappy, as she was tracked and followed on social media on her travails. She was the first bird that we tracked traveling across the northern part of the Arabian Sea from India to the Horn of Africa. And this was widely picked up, included by the New York Times, who ran an article which actually ended up on the front page of the China edition of the International New York Times. And that provided really exceptional coverage for migratory birds in a country where then, even now, environmental issues were only just beginning to rise up the agenda. So we tracked Flappy, and she was followed widely over almost two annual cycles, until sadly we received the final location for Flappy on the 17th of May 2018 in Myanmar. Now, she might not have made it back to her northern Mongolia breeding home range for the third time, but in fact, last year we did almost. We went to Kirk bird ringing station for the Mongolian Cuckoo Project, which is 80 kilometers south-southwest of Flappy's breeding range. This project is a collaboration with our partners, the Wildlife Science and Conservation Centre for Mongolia, and has been supported by the Oriental Bird Club. And we travelled from Ulaanbaatar 9 hours by bone-shaking journey really, by a van or bus to Kirk bird ringing station, which you can see here. This riparian woodland here and the coniferous woodland on the side valley is the first habitat that many migratory birds see when they cross the Gobi Desert on their northward spring migration. And the area down here, which is occupied by breeding cuckoos, also has host species such as Blythe's pipit and yellow-breasted bunting, which they're exploiting. This building was just being completed when we arrived. It's the Kirk bird ringing station, and we were able to use that as a pretty plush HQ for us to tag the cuckoos in. This yurt here shows the accommodation associated with the ringing station, occupied largely by the local ringing team. And whilst we were there, we were able to catch 5 cuckoos, one oriental cuckoo named Nomad that migrated northwards from this site up into the central Siberian plateau, but also 4 common cuckoos which stayed in the area, including Bayan and Onan, both of whom hit the headlines in the media this spring because of their migration exploits that I'll talk about a little bit later. Whilst we were there, as well as tagging cuckoos, we also got to visit some local schools to talk to them about cuckoos and the wildlife in their area in general. They turned out to be really quite surprisingly knowledgeable about the birds in their area, we thought. And each school was able to suggest some names to call the cuckoos, and they voted on which ones they preferred. And eventually each school chose one or two names for the cuckoos. And this was a really good way of sort of binding some engagement from the local school children in the project. Not only that, but thanks to Richard Porter, when Namjar, one of the cuckoos, visited Socotra, an island off the coast of Yemen on migration, Richard's intervention resulted in an exchange of letters between the children in Mongolia and the children in Yemen. And we were really pleased, all of the team was, that we'd been able to link children, connect children across continents through the wonders of bird migration. So if we go back to this slide and look at all the different populations that we have tracked, by tracking all these different populations, we've really learned a lot about the factors which shape the migrations of each of these different populations. And these Far Eastern migrations here include a migration which is so long, it actually takes me 3 Google Earth images to show it. And that's of these birds tracked by our friends from Copenhagen, starting off here in Kamchatka in the Russian Far East. They then move over the Sea of Japan and northern Japan, through Russia, down through China, turn west underneath the Himalaya, and then stop over here in India, sorry. After the stopover in India, they then move across the northern part of the Arabian Sea into the Horn of Africa, before migrating south down the east coast of Africa, and then turning west to a final wintering destination in the far southwestern part of the African continent in Namibia. And this migration is a mammoth displacement of 16,000 kilometers from the breeding grounds to the wintering grounds. It's actually the longest land bird migration which has so far been documented. And in fact, according to a recent paper by Marius Sonvale and others, it's a migration which shouldn't exist. They looked at species level migrations in relation to trade-offs between the costs and benefits of migrating, and a similar but shorter migration of the Amur falcon from northeastern China to southeastern Africa had the lowest predictive value of any land bird migration in their study. To understand why that migration does in fact exist, we need to look in a little bit more detail at the costs of migration. These costs are often considered in terms of energy, time, and exposure to hazards. And some questions we need to ask ourselves are, how costly actually are these for this migration? Do these costs actually increase proportionally to distance? And also, why not use a wintering area closer to the breeding grounds? So firstly, energy, and this is often seen as a trade-off of distance against energy gained at either end of the migration. This map shows the stopovers of the Kamchatka cuckoos, different colour for each bird. And these graphs here you can see show the annual cycle of NDVI, an index of vegetation greenness, which tells us about ecological productivity for each of the locations they occupied. So for this bird here at the breeding location, you can see a grey line showing the big peak of vegetation greenness and productivity during the summer. And these two vertical black lines delimiting the period when the bird was there. And you can see it's present in a really big peak of resource availability. Similarly, if we go to the final wintering destination of this bird, we can see that it was present during an annual peak of resource availability. And this means that there's surplus ecological productivity that can't be exploited by resident birds because they're limited by these troughs of resource availability, either in winter or in the dry season. And so consequently, there's plenty of resources for the migratory birds, such as the cuckoo, to exploit. Now, by having a staged migration, they're also able to exploit these similar peaks at other stages of the annual cycle. Here you can see a stopover where the bird has hit an annual peak. At other times, they don't necessarily always hit the peak, but there's a surplus of NDVI compared to the low periods of the year, which means that across the annual cycle, they're able to integrate these peaks of productivity. So although this migration is very costly in terms of the energy required, the relative expense is minimized by integrating surplus productivity across the entire annual cycle. Next, time, and that's the time not only takes for the bird to travel, but more importantly, to fatten, to accumulate the resources that will fuel that journey. And this time can be a biological cost if it results in a loss of opportunities for other activities, for instance, breeding. This map here shows the arrival times of nominate race Far Eastern canorus cuckoos breeding in Mongolia, Russia, and Kamchatka. And you can see they all arrived somewhere between the end of May and the end of the first week of June. And if we look at that graph again for this bird in Kamchatka, you can see that its arrival, as are the other birds, very well timed to exploit this peak of resources, both to feed themselves, but also in the case of the cuckoos, to exploit the breeding of the other host species that will also be homing in on this peak. These arrival times are at least a month later than we see in the UK. And in fact, we often see the first, well, every year we see the first autumn departures from the UK in the first few days of June. So we have a situation where in one end of the breeding range in the UK, birds have started to move south, whilst on the other opposite end of the breeding cycle, some birds are still migrating towards their breeding destination. And what this shows us is that the late availability of these Far Eastern breeding grounds reduces the time constraints. If they needed to be back earlier, they may not be able to have time to migrate between that resource peak in Namibia and the resource peak back in Kamchatka. Even so, we think it's actually quite a tall order for them. And we saw that this spring in the migrations of Onan, who migrated 9,000 kilometers in 16 days from Kenya to northeastern China this spring. And also Bayan, who migrated the same distance in about 22 days before, unfortunately, he succumbed in southwestern China. And this shows you that these birds really are racing at this time of year to get back, and that actually they're on the edge in terms of their energy balance, potentially vulnerable to predation or to not finding enough food at their stopovers. So clearly, we need to understand more about this and whether this has implications for the migrations of these birds as climate change changes the timing of the relative timing of events at different parts of the annual cycle. This was picked up by Frank Gardner, who did a piece on Radio 4, and also a nice piece on the BBC website. And I think this spring in particular, because of lockdown, seeing these birds flying across the continents like this was really quite engaging for people, and perhaps was reassuring that people that they could see that the globe was still working, as Ted Hughes put it, and that these migratory birds were still going about their business as usual. So finally, exposure to hazards, which can be seen as a mortality risk, especially during barrier crossings, and I'm thinking here of ocean crossings, but also desert crossings. And this map shows the ocean crossings of the cuckoos that we tracked in the Beijing and Kamchatka cuckoo projects. And you can see these lines here as they migrate across, covering 2,200 to 3,500 kilometers, and crossings which take them between 48 and 72 hours. And across these two projects, we saw no mortality during 12 ocean crossings, or even any mortality on the stopovers either side of them. So there was no indication at all that these birds were struggling. And the reason they're able to do this so successfully is because they migrate between the ITCZ, the Intertropical Convergence Zone, which is a frontal system which moves from north to south in autumn and the reverse in spring. And this does two things, really. First of all, it brings rains to the reception area, improving the stopover quality of where they're flying to, so they get to replenish their reserves quite quickly. But also, it provides favourable light tailwinds for the crossing. So these birds, unlike John Shorty et al., which unfortunately met terrible conditions off Norway, these birds are ushered across by predictable light tailwinds on their oceanic crossings. So we can see that high quality stopovers either side of the sea crossing and a risk-averse strategy exploiting predictable conditions enable these birds to navigate what appears to be a hazardous ocean crossing quite safely. In fact, in the Mongolian project, we have seen one mortality event soon after a crossing. It wasn't even a particularly long one. Onan had crossed the northern part of the Arabian Sea and then crossed southern Arabia before he became settled in a stopover in southwestern Yemen. And he died a couple of days later, quite suddenly. And we're not exactly sure why. It could have been predation, but I think what this shows us is it reinforces the fact that it's not the crossing, it's the quality of the stopovers and the predictability of conditions, which is the most important thing for a successful migration. So overall, we can see that it's possible that selection for a shorter migration might actually be weaker than we expected before we thought about these things. But still, we have one more question. Why not use a wintering area closer to the breeding grounds? Well, it's perfectly possible, or quite possible, that in fact there are no suitable wintering areas for the cuckoo given its ecology in Southeast Asia or Australasia. But there's also another possibility which might contribute to this, and that's in this map, which shows the midwinter locations of oriental cuckoos according to eBird, these purple squares. And you can see that it's actually quite abundant potential competitor species. There's hundreds of thousands of pairs, even in European Russia, let alone all the way across Siberia. It's already occupying these areas in Southeast Asia and Australasia, and this would probably reduce the fitness of any common cuckoo which attempted to winter here. So finally, some high-level conclusions. Firstly, high-quality stopovers may mitigate the costs of migration and enable these fantastically long, epic migrations to both evolve and persist. Secondly, stopover quality may influence population dynamics, as we've seen for the British population, where we've had differential survival of birds taking different routes, which correlated with the population decline at a local level within the UK. And finally, population and individual specific trade-offs need to be considered to fully understand migration. So the balance between resource maximisation and timing constraints, and how this affects the competition between different populations, as well as their own individual optimisation, things we need to understand more about if we're to understand what's going on with cuckoo migration. What next for global cuckoo tracking? Well, 2 or 3 things. Firstly, next year we're hoping to go to the Tibetan Plateau to tag some birds of the subspecies Subtelephonus. We would have done that this year if COVID hadn't have intervened. We're hoping that's going to be possible next year. Secondly, using Icarus tags to fill in gaps across the range. Central Siberia and Southern Europe are 2 areas we would really like to know more about what the migrations are going on there. Icarus is the new wildlife tracking platform with an antenna on the International Space Station, which can use particularly lightweight tags. And then obviously we're working on some scientific papers describing the longest migration and ultimately global patterns of cuckoo migration. So finally, I'd just like to say thank you very much to you for hopefully listening, and also to all of these people who have been involved in the project. It's all been a big team effort of people across the BTO, volunteers and co-workers within the BTO, as well as collaborators and other people from other organisations, and the people who funded it, particularly, of course, the cuckoo sponsors and champions who've been following the birds from the UK on the BTO website. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for another fantastic talk. Now, there's often a temptation, I think, from scientific speakers to do a runner just before the questions, because that's often the most difficult bit. But I'm told that that wasn't what John was up to there. Apparently, they had their internet go down at home, and he's now back with us. So I'll come to Chris in a minute or two if his internet will hold out. But let's fire a few questions your way first, friendly ones. Firstly, a question from Catherine asking, what's behind the higher rate of mortality on the southwesterly migratory route for cuckoos over Spain and Gibraltar? Could that be shooting or something else?
Well, what we do know is that the mortality events that we've seen in Spain have been particularly bad in years where there've been big droughts. So it's getting drier in general. And some years there've been particularly bad droughts with associated wildfires. And when that's happened, we've seen no birds at all successfully migrate through Spain. So we think that's a large part of it. And when there was a drought in 2017, I think it was, in Italy, we for the first time saw mortality after the original paper was published in Italy. So it does seem to be that drought is a large part of the picture on the southern European stopovers, but also the areas where the southwestern birds in particular come from in the UK are central and southern England, and those are the areas where moth declines have been the biggest. And the southwestern birds, we think, put on more fat before they migrate. They then migrate quicker down to Spain and spend less time there before going on. So we think they're putting on more fat in the stopovers here in the UK, so they could be differentially affected and not be able to catch up by moth declines here in the UK. So although we can't do anything about climate change in Spain, we might be able to do something to help the cuckoos on their way by providing better habitat for them here in the UK.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Chris. Well, seeing as you've mentioned climate change there, let's take a related question. John Morgan asks, could the synchronicity of NDVI and cuckoo utilisation become disrupted by climate change? And I guess there he's thinking particularly about your birds that have come from the Far East.
Yeah, so which is something we're looking into right now, actually, about these birds from the Far East. To how much leeway have they got in terms of their timing, and if the timing of the peaks changed along the way, and also in Africa, the relative timing of these peaks, could that be disrupted? The birds not be able to make that migration. The answer is I don't actually have a definitive answer for you quite yet, other than it is a possibility. But one thing I would say is that a lot of these environmental changes are quite deterministic in that this intertropical convergence zone, the ITCZ, moves south and north, taking rainfall with it. So these birds are exploiting seasonal patterns, which are quite predictable, and they aren't necessarily changed by climate change in the way that, for instance, timing of things on the breeding ground. So one thing we're looking at with both swifts and cuckoos from the UK is it possible that the timing of rainfall is actually in Africa, it doesn't change, so that holds them back in terms of them being able to come back to the UK in time to exploit earlier spring. So yeah, it's definitely a possibility that these NDVI peaks and the rainfall patterns could become asynchronous, and that could disrupt the migrations. But I don't have a definitive answer for you yet.
Thanks, Chris. I'll perhaps fire one more question your way. I'm really sorry to the many people I'm not going to be able to get onto. There's been a flurry both here and on the Facebook live stream, and we're not going to be able to cover them all. But just one final question here, which I think is an interesting one from Ray Heaton. Thinking about young birds, have we tagged any young birds? Is there any knowledge of how young cuckoos, perhaps also young corncrakes, migrate? Do they fly straight south? Do they have orientation flights? Or do they join up with other migrants and use them in the absence of related guide birds?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. We haven't tagged any juvenile cuckoos, but our colleagues in Copenhagen have. They've tracked one or two successfully, and they ended up in pretty much the same place, but they didn't do it in quite the same way. They flew straighter and quicker than the adult birds. They are much more focusing on understanding how migrations develop within an individual than we are. And I think what they've found is well, so far they don't fully understand the difference between a juvenile and an adult cuckoo, and the modelling they've done doesn't really explain how the complex migrations of adult cuckoos, where they have a loop migration with very specific stopovers, actually arose. And it is possible that even for a species like the cuckoo, traditionally people think, well, adult cuckoos leave and then juvenile cuckoos leave later. That's certainly true within a population, but it is possible that some juvenile cuckoos could potentially learn about stopovers from adult cuckoos if there's some temporal overlap there. We don't. The bottom line is we don't know yet. So yeah, but certainly keep your eyes peeled. Our colleagues, as I say, from Copenhagen are studying this and actually carrying out displacement experiments. So they'll be much better placed to understand that than we are from our work.
Some of these don't know yet things are the most interesting bits, aren't they? And a good incentive for people to support our work so we can carry on doing this research. So thanks ever so much, Chris, for a great talk and fielding those questions. And I'm really sorry to everybody who we didn't get onto. John has stopped hiding in the wardrobe and has come back to answer one or two questions, I hope not too reluctantly. So John, the first I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, is one which I know will be right up your street given your other research interest. And this is on the national tree planting initiatives in response to the climate crisis, and your thoughts on the impact of that in relation to grassland extent, how that'll affect short-eared owls and other grassland birds, perhaps including breeding waders. And I know you'll have a lot to say on that.
Okay, well, absolutely. The planting of trees on otherwise open habitats will absolutely displace short-eared owls and waders. I think for short-eared owls, they could occupy some areas, and I think this is really interesting where we've actually got some of the data from the natural Arctic alpine shrubland habitats in Norway, is that if we could recreate some of those habitats at higher elevations, then some of these owls could actually move on to those higher elevations, those more exposed areas. It's also possible that sort of within these more extensive woodlands, that if we could actually have some open areas, some glades, I know, it's not sort of that alien to a more naturalistic rewilding approach, because all these woodlands would have naturally had open areas. There'd be periodic fires, there would have been grazing animals in them, and anyway, but some of those could be established and maintained, and if they were large enough, they could support short-eared owls re-establishment of mires in the lowlands or in sort of blanket mires again, which would be too wet to have trees, could again support short-eared owls. It's really interesting to actually watch some of these birds that have travelled into Eastern Europe, how they actually use those sort of lowland peatlands as well in those areas. So yeah, I think it would lose some habitats, but I think that sort of same rewilding initiative and planting initiative could actually create some opportunities elsewhere. I think we've just got to be, the more we know about these birds, the more we know about the other birds that use these things, then absolutely we can actually start thinking about other ways of actually incorporating those. You know, it does concern me at the moment that we've got such a high proportion of our short-eared owls supported by one, land use management, and that is for driven grouse shooting. And it's probably not really particularly wise to actually have quite literally all our short-eared owl eggs in that one management basket. So to actually think about some other land management issues, how we can get forests to support short-eared owls in the long term, ensuring that island populations are secure by perhaps sort of restoring those islands to their naturally restricted suites of predators would be an option. So I think there are things we could do for the future, absolutely.
Well, again, that just goes to show the importance of the tracking work, doesn't it? Finding out which areas the birds are using and where they're breeding successfully and so on, so we can make better management recommendations. Another question then related to what you just mentioned there, it's top rated, so I think we should cover it. Do you have much evidence, or is there much evidence that short-eared owls are targeted by gamekeepers on grouse moors or elsewhere?
Clearly they are, because some, you know, there's obviously direct evidence that, or, you know, people have caught gamekeepers red-handed shooting short-eared owls and being persecuted. Has to be said that none of the tagged owls have disappeared under any suspicious circumstances at all. Whether that's fortuitous or not, I don't know. So yes, it happens. What impact it has on the population, I don't know. And basically from our sample of tagged birds, quite literally none of those have disappeared under such circumstances.
Thanks, John. A question here of interest to those down in the southwest of England in particular, I suspect. There seem to be a lot of voles in the southwest, but why no breeding owls on Bodmin Moor? That's a question from Andrew Folds.
Okay, I don't really know Bodmin Moor particularly well. Whether there are too many ground predators down there, I don't know. I mean, there are sort of many areas of, for example, the West Highlands, areas that I do know that actually have suitable habitat for short-eared owls, but they tend not to breed very regularly. And they are the areas that actually do have high densities of foxes, stoats, weasels. You know, they're not managed for game birds. Those areas are managed for deer or as sheep farming estates. So there's no interest in controlling ground predators in those areas, which is, again, sort of comes back to, you know, perhaps we ought to be thinking about getting these birds or creating habitats that are suitable at higher elevations that are not necessarily support the high densities of ground predators, and ensuring security of the island populations as well. You know, we actually keep them in these places. But yeah, I'd be interested to know, you know, what the thoughts are on Bodmin Moor. Did it have a high numbers of foxes, stoats, weasels? It'd be interesting to know.
Thanks, John. Perhaps just take one more question. Again, apologies to those who we can't get on to. Someone asking, where do they roost during the day? They spend a lot of time in open areas, but it seems pretty dangerous to rest there in daylight. So do they go into the woods? And perhaps in answering that, you could mention a bit about the strategy in terms of the young birds leaving the nest and how that might be related to predator avoidance.
Okay. Yeah, they do sort of roost on the ground in the open. Got one or two birds have gone to roost for very short periods, often just one day in woodlands if they're on migration or if they're moving maybe in an area that they're not familiar with. But for the most part, they're roosting absolutely in the open. And again, I think it's sort of down to they just stay there quietly and hopefully do not attract predators to themselves. And as sort of Ben says, that is sort of actually an approach with the young. You know, the nests are vulnerable to predation. However, sort of the young, as soon as they are capable of thermoregulating themselves, rather than actually staying in the nest and being brooded, they disperse quite widely in the heather. much to the annoyance of most bird ringers, to be quite honest, because you can actually find a nest, think it's great, you want to go back there and ring the chicks, and then find they've actually scattered really widely in the heather, and you can't actually find them to ring them or to even monitor the nests. But again, that sort of, I guess it spreads the risk out that if a fox or something should actually find that nest, maybe they will find one or two of the young, but they're not going to find all of them. It's actually sort of spreading the risk out. To expect they do that. Obviously, as an adult bird, that if they, a predator does come and finds them, then they have actually got the option of flying off. The young clearly don't have that, certainly in the early stages.
Fantastic. Thanks, John. I'm sure you can all tell John's incredibly passionate and knowledgeable about this subject, and we could talk about this all evening, but time is moving on. So I'm going to move on. Thank you again, John, and for rejoining us after your internet glitch. And next up, we're going to invite Ros Green, who's going to talk to us about amazing work studying Shelduck. So Ros, if you're happy to share your screen.
Yep, hopefully you can see that now.
That's looking great, Ros. Over to you.
You can all hear me okay? Yeah, cool. So I'm Ros Green. I'm a research ecologist within the Wetland and Marine Research team. So I'll tell you today about our recent research on Shelduck migration. But before I do, I'll give you a brief overview of our department and why this Shelduck research was necessary in the first place. So my department primarily researches seabirds, waterbirds and waders, because the UK holds internationally significant populations of these species. Many of these species utilise the North Sea throughout the year for feeding, breeding, overwintering, and they cross the North Sea during migration regularly. So a lot of our department's research is focused around offshore wind farm developments and the effects and impacts these may have on those populations. The UK is a world leader in offshore wind energy production and already has over 40 operational offshore wind farms with a generation capacity of about 10 gigawatts. So here you can see the dark blue shapes on this map are operational wind farms currently in our waters, in the German waters, Dutch waters and Belgian waters here. So this, in the first 4 months of this year, that accounted for 30% of the UK's energy generation, which shows that this is a really significant renewable energy generation system for our country. And the UK government has just announced plans to increase this capacity to 40 gigawatts by 2030, which would be enough to power all homes in Britain, obviously not industry as well, but that's an awful lot of energy generation. And this would form a key part of the government's plans for net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So as you can see, this would mean that there'll be a lot of offshore wind farms around our shores being built in the next decade or so. And most of these are clustered in the North Sea. Here you can see everything that isn't a dark blue square, these sort of quite small ones close to the coast at the moment. Everything else is a offshore wind farm that's currently planned. And also the other countries bordering the North Sea are increasing their offshore capacity as well. And there are also plans shortly for increases in the Irish Sea over here and around Scottish waters. So these wind farms are obviously very important for mitigating the impacts of climate change, which will have far-reaching consequences for all species globally. But this level of development has the potential to affect many species that utilise the North Sea regularly throughout their annual cycle. There are 4 main recognised offshore wind farm impacts for avian species. The one most people have heard of is the collision risk, so direct mortality by impacting the structures around the offshore wind farm. But there are these others, so barrier effects. So often seabirds, for instance, don't like to go between structures, so they'll fly around a wind farm instead, which increases the energy output of their movements in general. There's also indirect effects, for instance, habitat change, which means that they can no longer use the area for feeding, for instance, and direct displacement. So, for instance, puffins or whatever, overwintering in the seas just can't use that area anymore, or red-throated divers, for instance. Offshore wind farms have when they're putting in development applications, have to complete environmental impact assessments to try and quantify what these effects might be to species that are known to use the area and are protected by local sites. But to do these environmental impact assessments accurately, you need quite a lot of data, which often isn't available for an awful lot of species. Unfortunately, we don't have many WEBS counters or BBS counters in the middle of the North Sea. So instead, bespoke surveys are often conducted before the applications are put in. But this data collection is often limited by weather conditions quite heavily. So it's very difficult to do boat surveys in poor weather, for instance, fog, high sea state, etc. Overnight, it can be very difficult to do surveys when a lot of things are migrating. And also short pulse migrants, where a significant proportion of the population migrate across that area in a very short time. It can be quite difficult to pick up data on that with the standard survey methodologies. So a lot of the gaps for these species are being filled now with various methods because of the increase in development going on. But there is still much to learn about an awful lot of species in order to have accurate environmental impact assessments. Which brings me neatly on to Shelduck and why it's important to be researching this species. So Shelduck are protected by 32 UK SPAs, highlighted here in dark green or light green. They're mostly coastal because all of these are for the non-breeding population of Shelduck. There are no breeding SPAs for protecting Shelduck. That's mostly because they accumulate in high numbers in these areas during the winter. And the population is known to conduct a molt migration every year. So the majority of the British breeding population flies over the North Sea to the Wadden Sea here, where with the majority going to the German Bight here and some in the Dutch Wadden Sea, although there are also 5 known UK molting sites around the coastline. So, and also lots of continental breeding Shelduck will come to the UK during the winter to those SPA sites, primarily to avoid lots of cold weather on the continent. So there's lots of movement of Shelduck backwards and forwards across the North Sea. So our first piece of research on Shelduck, we were contracted to conduct a literature review to try and gain an understanding of what knowledge there is on Shelduck migration so far, and whether there's enough to help inform these environmental impact assessments. What we found is that generally the published literature on Shelduck migration is from studies conducted in the 1960s to 1980s, and there's very little additional publications since then based on novel data. So what knowledge there is has the potential to be relatively out of date. And so as part of this literature review, we looked at the ringing data that we hold. So there's a century's worth of ringing data in the BTO database. Generally, this just confirmed what the literature said. So you can see here for a century's worth of data, we've actually got relatively small sample sizes. This map is for birds ringed during the breeding season in the UK and subsequently recovered on the continent. So that's representing the British breeding population. And this map is for birds ringed during the breeding season on the continent and subsequently recovered in the UK. So that's the continental breeding population. And this confirms what the literature says. British breeding birds are mainly recovered on the continent during the molting season here in the Wadden Sea, and continental breeding birds are mainly recovered in the UK during the winter when they come over for the winter months. But we were hoping this ringing data might provide more information on the temporal scale of the migration, so how quickly it happens and what routes the birds might take across the North Sea. But unfortunately, the ringing data didn't do that. Here is the all the recoveries that happened within 2 months of the original ringing date. We only had 4 movements across the sea, 3 across the North Sea, and 2 of those were recovered of dead birds. We can't be certain of the actual finding location, whether they had just floated across the sea. So we've got this one record here of a female recovered 58 days after it was ringed at Icklesham. recovered here in the Dutch Wadden Sea. But obviously within 58 days, it could have taken any number of routes to reach that location, which may or may not have caused it to pass wind farms en route. It could have taken this shortest sea crossing and come up the coast, for instance. So within our literature review, we highlighted several knowledge gaps that are fairly important for environmental impact assessments. There's no high resolution data on the routes that Shelduck take across the North Sea. And so it's very difficult to know whether they will interact with offshore wind farms at all. There's very little data on the timings of those migrations. So we know that the birds do migrate between June and August and then come back for the winter, but we don't know specifically when the majority are migrating, whether that's at day or night, and how long the actual crossing takes. And there's very little data on flight height or speed at all, which are essential criteria for conducting collision risk models. They're necessary data for those. So we made several recommendations in this literature review, but the major one was to conduct a tracking study to help us fill these main knowledge gaps. There have been tracking studies conducted on Shelduck before, but most of these have been on the continent and with very small sample sizes, and none of those, as far as we're aware, have recorded movements across the North Sea at all. So there's no current tracking data for that. So our pilot tracking study, we wanted to maximise the likelihood of recording an interaction with offshore wind farms. So we knew that tracking in East Anglia was most likely to be productive for that, and identified a catching site at Havergate, RSPB Havergate Island down here in the Aldor Estuary SPA, which is close to lots of offshore wind farms, and the site staff there have been absolutely excellent with helping us get to grips with the Shelduck population and make the catching possible. So Havergate Island is here within the Aldor Estuary SPA, where Shelduck are a protected feature during the non-breeding season, and is also situated close to the Devon Estuary and Stour and Orwell Estuary SPAs, where Shelduck are also protected. So onto the tracking work. We successfully managed to catch 4 birds for this pilot tracking study, 2 males and 2 females. Here you can see the tag IDs I'll refer to later in the talk, and they were also all fitted with colour rings so that we could hopefully identify them after the tags had fallen off. Unlike the work presented by John and Chris, these tags are short-term deployment. So we knew with the method we used here, which is called glue mounting, that when the birds reached their molting ground and molted the body feathers under this tag, the tag would drop off. We were only expecting these to stay on for a month or two. And as we tagged them on the 12th of July, that was exactly what happened. We only got an average of about a month's data from each of the 4 birds, varying from 18 days to 42 days. So onto the good bit, the bit that people are really interested in. How did the tracking data, what did it return? So we tagged them here at Havergate in the middle. Turned out that although these 4 birds were acting as a sort of flock when we caught them, they actually operated individually thereafter. So the 2 males, after about a day, travelled up to this estuary here, but then one went north and one went south. This bird used the Devon Estuary SPA for a while, had an aborted, or it appeared to be an aborted migration attempt early one morning, hung out on Havergate for a while and then went off. And the other 3 birds utilised the top end of the Aldor Estuary SPA before they migrated. And again, they all migrated individually of each other rather than as a flock, as has been recorded from the West Coast, for instance. So the migration, this was very exciting for us. We had no guarantees that these birds would migrate across the North Sea. The wash up here is a known molting site, so it was possible they would all just hop up there. So it's excellent that they all migrated. And as I said, the 4 of them migrated separately. So the first bird to head off was this Shello 1, who was a male. He took a southerly route, crossing here to the sort of directly to the Dutch coast and then up the Dutch coast into the Wadden Sea. Then 2 days later, Shello 3 on the 18th of July migrated much more sort of directly to the Wadden Sea and into the Wadden Sea. A further 2 days later, Shello 8, this yellow line, took a much more northerly route. We think this was heavily influenced by a weather front, as you've seen with John and Chris. Weather can heavily influence migration routes. And there was a fairly significant front coming through at the time of this. We haven't had time to analyse the data to confirm that, but that's our suspicions. And then Shello 7, 2 days later again, took this similar route to Shello 3 and ended up all here, somehow ended up all very similarly, even though several days apart, within 1 kilometre of each other was the endpoint of these three's migration. And this point was only 6.5 kilometres north of that, which given this distance is about 250 kilometres, is quite impressive to end so closely and tightly together. As you can see, we've got some wind farm interactions recorded. This one was of particular interest, although as your keen-eyed people may notice, these wind farms don't actually exist yet. They're still at the planning stage, so I suspect this Shelduck's been reading planning applications somehow. These two have migrated through a wind farm that's under construction, but actually at the time of tracking, there were no above sea level structures here. So we sort of inadvertently collected pre-construction data here. So any subsequent tracking, we might see differences there. And then there's these two wind farms here with close interactions, although the data aren't detailed enough really to understand how these interactions might have happened. Overall, these crossings took about 3.5 hours to go across the sea crossing and just over 4 hours to make it to this first stopover site here. So all in all, very good data from just 4 birds, which is very small sample size, but very promising. We also collected speed data, which as I mentioned is very important for collision risk models. Here, the black boxes represent the flight speed data for all of the tracking period, so about the approximate month we got from each bird, which shows that on average they're flying at about 30 knots when they're up in the air. But the red boxes are the migration flight speeds, which show a slight increase in that average. They're flying a bit faster whilst they're crossing the North Sea, which increases their risk slightly for collisions if you assume they can collide from their ordinary flight speeds. We also collected height data, both through GPS and pressure sensors, but we haven't analysed the pressure sense data thoroughly yet, but it looks very similar to this, with the birds on average flying at about 35 metres above sea level, but ranging from sea level to, well, on average about 100 metres, but some were recorded up to 354 metres above sea level. Offshore wind farm blades sort of rotate from approximately 25 metres to 130 metres above sea level. So again, they are flying at heights that could put them at risk of collisions, but we need more data before we can actually assess whether they interact with offshore wind farms at all. So the post-migration data, this in itself was extremely interesting. All 4 of the birds seem to spend an extended period of time in the Dutch Wadden Sea here. I'm hoping you can see my cursor highlighting these areas. Stopovers have never been recorded for Shelduck in the Wadden Sea before, as far as we know, and I'm not even, I haven't come across any reference to them being suggested that Shelduck might do stopovers in the Dutch Wadden Sea before they reach their molting grounds. So this in itself is very novel data. You can see here the stopover times. Shello 1 then carried on to the German Bight to molt. We think that's where its tag dropped off as expected, and the same for Shello 8 here. So that's 1 male bird and 1 female bird. Shello 3, the tag dropped off in this Dutch Wadden Sea area, so it's possible the bird molted here, or it may have carried on to join these others in the German Bight. But the most interesting bird for these post-migration movements was this Shello 7 male, which really did a there and back again and there again. It actually added 1,000 kilometres onto its migration as for no apparent reason, as far as we can tell. It travelled to the German Bight, spent 6 days there. It was in the Dutch Wadden spent 6 days there, travelled to the German Bight, spent less than a day there, came back, spent 9 days there, went back again, 4 days there, and then back again where its tag dropped off. So we have no explanation for why a bird might choose to do this before stopping to molt its flight feathers. Again, very novel and interesting data that warrants further research. And luckily, we've seen several of these birds back after tagging. We weren't really expecting much return on colouring sightings because they don't tend to be spotted very regularly. But Shelduck, the female, has been seen on these dates. So it seems to spend most of its annual cycle on Havregate. It breeds there and seems to only be away from the site for molting. So that's a fairly direct migration across the North Sea and back again. Shelduck, however, wasn't seen again until the 6th of March. So it seems to have spent most of the winter away from Havregate, came back for breeding, and again has disappeared. So this one, we don't know where it spends the rest of the winter, which suggests its migratory strategy might be different. And Shelduck 7, that one that did the 1,000 kilometres extra in the Wadden Sea, was seen at Clay and Salthouse Marshes on the 22nd of March this year, which was about 100 kilometres north of Havregate, which suggests it doesn't spend much time on Havregate, maybe just comes down for pre-migration, which means it comes 100 kilometres south to cross the North Sea to go 100 kilometres north back into the Wadden Sea. So again, a different migratory strategy and warrants further research. So in summary, we conducted the literature review, which confirmed that they do migrate across the North Sea and therefore may interact with offshore wind farms, but there's not enough detailed data to assess what these impacts might be, and therefore further data collection is required. The pilot tracking study was successful, showed that they take variable routes across the North Sea that may well bring them into contact with offshore wind farms. We demonstrated the timings, so most of those birds left at night or in the dawn, early dawn, so it's unlikely that daytime surveys would pick up Shelduck migrating, as they're doing it mostly overnight. And we collected new data on flight heights and speeds, although obviously these samples are small for the pilot tracking study. What next? Essentially, we can't leave it there. So our research development plans. So these data I've just presented are about to be published in Ringing and Migration, which means that we are now updating the literature on Shelduck, as I said that most of the previous publications have been from the 60s to 80s. So this is good to update the knowledge that we have. We plan to track 30 new Shelduck from 3 different UK locations in June of next year, just ahead of the migration, which is work that we funded by BEIS here, the government department, who's managed by John Hartley at Hartley Anderson, who will also help fund. We've just put in a proposal to fund a PhD, which will be part funded by BTO as well as Hartley Anderson and BEIS, based at Liverpool. This PhD will aim to build a holistic view of Shelduck migration across the North Sea, back and forward, hopefully for the entire population, Northwest population, and we'll also use all the available BTO data on Shelduck and anything else we can find for an updated estimate of population, of the population numbers and trends, so that we can put these together, hopefully to assess what proportion of the population may interact with offshore wind farms, and what their likely interactions may be, and conduct collision risk models, essentially to see whether portions of the Shelduck population might be at risk from all of these offshore wind farm developments that are planned for the North Sea. But also, all of you can all help with this if you ever fancy looking at Shelduck, because all of our surveys have less data than fewer data than I would expect for Shelduck. They seem to go under the radar for many birders. They're common and conspicuous, but generally overlooked. So if you do BBS, webs, bird track, ringing, any of these can provide extra data that will feed directly into the PhD. So please get out there, look at Shelduck. They're cooler than people think. This work wouldn't have been possible. I'd like to thank everyone who's helped, from the funding from Bayes, as I said, is managed by John Hartley at Hartley Anderson. My project managers, Angus and Neil, have been brilliant, made this possible. All the staff and volunteers at Havergate Island who made the catching possible, they were brilliant beforehand, and all of the staff who helped me make the catch on the day and do the tagging. The British and Irish Ringing Scheme who provided the data for the literature review initially, and everyone else who has provided any data or interesting facts about Shelduck in the last year or so. We're gently building a picture of how these Shelduck move across the North Sea, thanks to you. So thank you, anyone. Hopefully we've got time for some questions. If we don't get to your question or you've got any useful information about Shelduck, you happen to have done all this research already and can give me all the answers, do contact me through the BTO website as well.
Thanks so much, Ros. And we've got time for a few questions. Absolutely. All of this work tagging the 3 species you've heard about today just reminds me how, you know, the birds themselves don't see the borders that we humans see. You know, we've been hearing about the cuckoos going, you know, all the way south into sub-Saharan Africa, and the short-eared owls just treating seemingly the whole of Northern Europe as their home, and to see your Shelducks just happily crossing over the English Channel and the North Sea and so on. Really fascinating stuff. I'm going to start with a question that I know you're familiar with, to warm you up, because you've said to me previously, you always get asked this whenever you give a talk about Shelducks. So why study Shelducks? Why Shelducks?
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping part of my presentation has convinced you why. They are overlooked by a lot of research groups, it seems. They're sort of not claimed by the duck people or the goose people or the seabird researchers, or they're often lumped with waders because they feed on mudflats, but the wader researchers don't want to look at them either. So they sort of just seem to have fallen through the cracks of research. And for such a common and conspicuous species, there's very little research on them that I can find in the short time we've been looking at them. So yeah, there's a lot left to learn about them, and hopefully we can do that quite effectively because they're so easy to spot and quite widespread across the UK.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Ros. Now I'm going to take a question from the YouTube live stream. One of Steve's Blacks asked a whole load of good questions. I'm sorry, Steve, we didn't manage to get onto some of your others. But Steve asks, that he says he sees a number of Shelducks sitting in local fields midsummer, and wonders if they're non-breeders or ones that have left their young with a crash. And perhaps in answering that, you could tell people just a tiny bit about the amazing breeding ecology of Shelduck, because people might be surprised to hear where they breed.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I have to admit not know a huge amount about their breeding ecology. It's another area with little research, but these are hole nesting species. So they pair up and can often be found down rabbit burrows, breeding down there. So again, they're quite difficult to nest record for that reason, because they're hard to get into. And that's not just at coastal sites. They're breeding quite far inland these days. They can also be found in haystacks, any holes in buildings. I know at Martinmere, they've got a significant population breeding in boxes just on the ground with hole nesting, a hole leading into them. So yeah, they're hole nesting birds. And there is a significant, or there's a decent proportion of the birds each year that don't breed. So Steve's observations might be correct there, that those are non-breeding birds hanging out. They are incredibly territorial when they're actively breeding and hold territory or hold a female at least very defensively. So if you're seeing clusters of birds together, the chances are they're not breeding at all. And they're either non-breeders or failed breeders. I think generally they don't breed until they're 2 or 3 years old. So there's a reasonable portion of population not breeding every year.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ros. Question from George in the Q&A within Zoom. Do you think that Shelduck from more northerly locations will travel down to the area off Havergate, or I guess the East Coast generally, before crossing, or do you think they take a more direct route?
Excellent question. And that's what we're hoping to find out with the 30 extra birds we plan to tag this year. We've got, I mentioned 3 locations. We're hoping to track again from Havergate, to track 10 from Martinmere, which is a West Coast population a bit more, to see maybe if they travel more as a group and in waves rather than as bits of a few birds here and there, and at Teesside, which will be a bit more of a northerly population. So the hope is by comparing 10 birds from each of those sites, we might see some variation. And the Teesside birds, we don't know really. We're wondering whether they might take that direct route, which would actually avoid an awful lot of the offshore wind farms that there are, or whether they follow the coast down to take a shorter sea crossing, which would then bring them down towards the Wash and Havergate and into that area with more offshore wind farm development. So watch this space, essentially. Hopefully we will begin to answer that question next year, but I suspect it will take a lot longer than that to build up a full picture of what's going on.
A really good example, though, of why more research is needed on this species. Okay, a question from Sarah Harris. I wonder if this is our Sarah Harris. Could the tags potentially reveal where there's a death caused by collision, for example, with a turbine? And I'll give you a related question to answer at the same time from one of our attendees on Zoom. What happens to the tracking devices when they fall off? Are they at the moment biodegradable? Can they be recovered? And maybe you could also answer a sub-question in future. If technology changes, could there be ways of finding them and recovering them or reusing them so they don't add to marine litter?
Yeah, very good questions all round. The first part of that question, so the collision, whether it can actively record a collision, these are GPS GSM tags, so they download their data via the mobile network. And at these tags, we're scheduled to do that every day. So we only get, they're collecting data every 15 minutes, but we only get those data once a day. So it's unlikely we would record data from a collision because the tag or the bird would then more than likely end up in an area with no GSM coverage. But if the bird washed to shore or within GSM range with the tag still attached, we could receive those data and perhaps manage to interpret the data like that. There are tags being developed that deliberately transmit data on impact. So if the tag experiences high acceleration, which equates to an impact, they will automatically transmit any data they hold. So it's possible. At the moment, my feeling is it's actually quite unlikely that Shelduck will collide. We can't rule it out at this stage, but yeah, we'll wait and see and keep abreast of the technology as it continually develops in order to use the best devices possible at the time of tracking. In relation to the second part of that question, these tags aren't biodegradable. This is something we're aware of and make every attempt to retrieve them when we can. Of these 4 tags, certainly 2 of them we did retrieve. They fell off in the Wadden Sea, transmitted their location when they washed ashore, and we made contact with people to go and pick them up. One of the 2 that we didn't retrieve was in a retrievable location, but in a field with a very angry bull. So we couldn't retrieve that before another high tide came through and washed it out of that field. And it must have landed either in an area with no GSM coverage or upside down, so it couldn't solar charge anymore and cease to transmit data. So, and the 4th tag we know was picked up by somebody on a beach, because I've got points of it moving across Germany, but they never sent the tag, never made contact with us to send the tag back. So I'm hoping really that was put in a bin, has ended up in landfill. But yes, every effort will be made to retrieve these tags so that they don't become marine litter, and they do float and they do transmit their data so long as they've got battery and GSM coverage.
Brilliant, thanks, Ros. And another couple here relating to operational wind farms. Ptolemy asking about whether we get flight height and speed data from the tags, and is there any evidence that Shelduck might change their height near operational wind farms? And I think maybe you pronounce Naber, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, asking might the operational wind farms be shut down on demand to reduce the collision threat if there are flocks shown to be flying through?
So in relation to that first question, yes, these tags do collect speed and height data. And given the short amount of time today, I didn't manage to show it. There's actually quite interesting data from these tags showing that the birds tend to go up in altitude, up to that sort of 345 metre point I mentioned, while they're leaving the coast, go very high and then drop down to sea level during the sort of midsection of their migration, and then increase altitude again as they reach the Dutch coast. So this is only preliminary data really from these 4 birds, and it was a bit variable, the data rate we got during the migration, so it's quite hard to see with 2 of the tags that that's the case. But that would then coincide with them being at a higher altitude in the sort of coastal regions where the offshore wind farms are concentrated at the moment, dropping down during the midsection of the migration where there are fewer wind farms, and coming up again before they meet the Dutch coast, which again is where the Dutch wind farms are concentrated. I don't think the data we're seeing is related to offshore wind farms. I think that's just the indicative flight profile that they take as they cross the North Sea. But that would potentially reduce the collision risk. Again, not that I'm saying there is necessarily a collision risk anyway. We haven't got data to support that yet at all. And the second part of that question was, can we shut off wind farms? That was it. I'm not aware of that in offshore wind farms, but it's certainly a strategy being talked about for onshore wind farms that are known to be in sort of raptor migration hotspots and things where radar can pick up migrating flocks, and wind farms can be shut down. My other colleagues are more knowledgeable than me, but I can't see why that strategy couldn't be used for offshore wind if there were the data to support that it was worth it. But everything's a trade-off, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. We need that renewable energy to mitigate climate change. And if we can demonstrate through data collection that actually Shelduck and many other species aren't at risk of collision anyway because they change their behaviour to avoid those structures, then it wouldn't be necessary to turn them off anyway. The better thing is to concentrate on methods of ensuring that the developments don't happen in high-risk areas in the first place, for which we need this data to identify where those areas might be, and then use the data to inform planning decisions, essentially, on where those wind farms are placed.
And it's what I would suggest classic BTO to be doing really relevant research that can allow informed evidence-based decision making. And the work you're doing at Shelduck is fantastic in that respect. And other work as well with gulls is very topical. There's a lot of marine research going on, which you may hear about later on in the week. We promised to finish at 8:45, and I'm going to be a disciplined host and make sure that we do more or less that. So I hope everybody on the call has really enjoyed the session. Thanks again to all of the speakers for 3 fantastic talks. I'm sure if you were here in person, you'd join me in a round of applause. And thank you, of course, for joining in our first ever virtual conference session. I mentioned at the start that our research now more than ever relies on your individual support, and many thanks to those of you who support us already through membership and donations. As I've said, if you can support us, I know it's not easy for everyone just now, but if you can support us via this special conference link, bto.org/support, we would hugely appreciate that support. We need your help just now to get through this difficult time. I hope you can join us for more talks later in the week. The next session is tomorrow, starting at 2 o'clock. You'll hear research on curlews, a couple of talks on that work, much of which was funded by recent appeals. And you'll also hear about some amazing research using thermal imaging cameras to find jack snipe to better improve our population estimates. So until then, or until next time, thank you again for joining us. Hopefully see you again soon. Bye for now.